Proverbs 19:4, it's there on your handout, says, "Wealth brings many friends, but a poor man is deserted by his friends." Well, you can understand that how a wealthy person might have many friends, right? It's advantageous to be friends with a wealthy person. But a poor man is deserted by his friends. I mean, there's no advantage, perhaps, to be a friend of a poor person. The question here might be, what's religious about this? This seems to be a secular saying, maybe something that you would hear in the advice column of a newspaper, or if you go to a restaurant and you get those fortune cookies, something that you might find on one of those. Sounds like secular advice. We'll come back and talk about this a little bit. And then Proverbs 12:21 says, "No ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble." This seems to say that those who are righteous will not experience any trouble in this life, but it's the wicked who will experience trouble. Well, this doesn't seem to be true to reality, does it? I know a lot of righteous people who are experiencing trouble, and I know some wicked people who are doing really well in life. So what are we to make of this particular proverb? One more, Proverbs 10:22. "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it." So how do you know you've been blessed by God? You're rich. That's what it says, doesn't it? The blessing of the Lord makes one rich. Well, what if you are not rich? Does that mean you are not experiencing the blessing of the Lord? Are these the right conclusions to draw from these proverbs? Sounds more like the health and wealth gospel. You can see where the health and wealth gospel might come from if these proverbs are not handled correctly. So how do we keep from misunderstanding these proverbs? How do we keep from drawing conclusions that would not be the right conclusions? What do these proverbs mean for us? So we first of all want to try to get at these questions by talking about what a proverb is. What is a proverb? And I have a definition on your handout. A proverb can be defined as a short, pithy saying in common use. A short, pithy saying in common use. Now, the word pithy means full of meaning. So, a short saying full of meaning in common use. In common use, people may know about it, have heard about it. A proverb might be used in life. So, a short, pithy saying in common use. Now, because they're short, proverbs are short. We're talking about these short proverbial sayings, usually 2 lines we're referring to. Because they're short, they state a general truth. We're going to see they're normally related to observation or experience, and you must apply them to life situations. So proverbs are meant to be applied to life situations. This is a part of what I'm going to read every once in a while from the book of Proverbs. This is a part of what Proverbs 22, 17 through 19 says. I'll read it. You may not have access to it, but just listen to what Proverbs 22, 17 through 19 says. "Incline your ear, hear the words of the wise, apply your heart to my knowledge. It will be pleasant if you keep them within you. If all of them are ready on your lips, that your trust may be in the Lord. I've made them known to you today, even to you." So these verses say that there should be an active effort to listen to what is being said so that you would learn knowledge. And then there are beneficial results if you keep them within you. Perhaps referring to memorizing parts of the Bible, memorizing Scripture, knowing them, having them ready on your lips. In other words, be ready to use them in life. Be ready to use them in different situations of life. And the outcome from these verses is that your trust in the Lord will be encouraged. So, because Proverbs are short, Because they're meant to apply to life situations, it would be a misuse of many proverbs if you made them universal statements, or if you made them try to apply to every situation. Okay, that's not how a proverb functions. It's not how they are to be used. A proverb states a general truth. And the force of a proverb in a situation is sort of diminished if you stop and say, well, there's these extenuating circumstances, there's these exceptions. No, you wouldn't want to do that if you're kind of trying to use a proverb in a life situation. They're meant to refer to particular life situations, and so you don't hear the exceptions or the qualifications. So a proverb deals with a slice of life, particular life situation. It takes wisdom to know how to apply a proverb properly. All right, I have two modern examples of proverbs, okay? First one in your handout, haste makes waste. Okay, think about it. What does that mean? Haste makes waste. Well, if someone does something hurriedly, makes a fast decision perhaps, there may be bad consequences. If you do something in a hurry, you might make mistakes. Okay? Another one, he who hesitates is lost. He who hesitates is lost. The person can't make a decision. He loses valuable opportunities because he just can't make a decision. Okay? Two different proverbs. You see that they don't apply across the board. They're not universal proverbs. They apply to particular situations in life. Haste makes waste would apply to a person, and this is a part of wisdom, to kind of know what kind of person you're dealing with, to kind of know what situation you're dealing with. This is partly the wisdom that the book of Proverbs will give to you. The first proverb would apply to a person who tends to make rash decisions. Haste makes waste. You're going too fast. You need to think through this a little bit more before you make this decision. Have you thought through it enough? Some people make quick decisions and can suffer for it because there's waste. There's bad consequences that might follow. But the second proverb, he who hesitates is lost, would apply to a person who's having trouble making a decision. Just can't pull the trigger. You know, the paralysis of analysis. Have you heard that phrase? Just continuing to analyze the situation over and over and over again. And by that time, maybe the opportunity is lost. So what kind of person are you dealing with? What kind of person would each of these proverbs apply to? This helps us understand, I think, Proverbs 26, verses 4 through 5. You might be familiar with these proverbs. It says, 26:5 says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Oh, I started in 5. I should have started in verse 4. Verse 4, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. I guess the Bible contradicts itself. Do you answer a fool or do you not answer a fool? Maybe it depends on the kind of fool you're dealing with. There's 3 or 4 major words for fool in Proverbs, but there's probably over 100 different types of people presented in the book of Proverbs. So that's a part of wisdom. Part of wisdom is knowing how to navigate difficult situations in life, how to navigate difficult people in life. And so it may depend on the kind of fool that you are dealing with in terms of whether you should answer or not. Sometimes you would not want to answer a fool, says, lest you be like him yourself. Sometimes you're talking to someone and it's just no use. it's fruitless to continue the conversation. And as the more you talk, the more you may become like the fool. And so it's good to just stop and not answer. But there may be other situations where the fool needs to be answered, depending on, again, the situation. He may need to hear something. Maybe others around you that are listening in may need to hear something. And so sometimes there would be a situation where you would want to answer a fool. It's very interesting. Jesus, in one of the trials that is recorded, Mark and Matthew, I think, record this trial. It's a mock trial. Part of it's a mock trial, and they bring false witnesses to testify against him. And when he's asked a question related to this, he keeps silent. He doesn't say anything. But then when the high priest asks him about whether or not he is the Christ, he answers. Because that's an opportunity to tell everyone there, testify to who he really is. So interesting, you see Jesus maybe putting this into practice. In I think Mark 14:61 is one of the places, and the other one is Matthew, I forget which chapter specifically. We could talk about another New Testament example. This one I have listed in your notes. Luke 9:50, Jesus says, "Whoever is not against you is for you." Whoever is not against you is for you. Now that's a context where the disciples want to prevent someone from casting out demons in Jesus' name. And Jesus says, whoever is not against you is for you. And in that context, what that means is this is a saying, a proverb against intolerant, narrow exclusivism. In Luke 11:23, Jesus says, he who is not with me is against me. And the context there is that those who were opposed to Jesus were accusing him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub. And so in that context, he says, he who is not with me is against me. You need to make a decision here. You can't be neutral, right? You got to decide whether what they are saying is true or whether what I say about myself is true. So you see Jesus using these two sayings, and it's because of the context in which he is dealing with. So if Proverbs are meant to apply to life situations, they're not meant to apply to every situation. And if you try to make some of these Proverbs into a universal truth, then you're going to run into difficulty. Now there's a minor clarification here, a minor exception. If a proverb uses the name God, usually in the book of Proverbs it's Lord in capitals. You ever see that, Lord in capitals? That's the covenant name of God. That's the name of God that became prominent in the Exodus event when God showed himself faithful to his covenant promises to his people. And he sent Moses to deliver his people. And Moses was the mediator, but God was the one who really delivered his people through the powerful manifestation of the plagues. And so it also shows God's willingness to fight for his people to deliver them. So that's the name Lord. That usually is the name that occurs in the book of Proverbs. So if the name Lord is in a proverb, then it tends to be on a higher level than just a human situation. And so an example of this would be over in chapter 15, verse 3. There's several of examples in this chapter of this, but let me look at verse 8 here. Chapter 15, verse 8 says, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is acceptable to him." The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. That's always true, isn't it? That's always true. And the prayer of the upright, the prayer of the one who honors God and trusts God, is acceptable to him. We know that that will always be true because he will accept the prayers of his people. So sometimes when the name Lord occurs in the Proverbs, it's on a different level. That's not always the case, but it's something to remember. All right, so we've looked at what is a proverb. We've tried to define a proverb, these individual proverbial sayings, and how they are meant to function. Okay? Next thing that we want to do is we want to try to understand the structure of the book of Proverbs, because that will help us with this question. It'll give us a certain perspective that is really helpful in thinking through the Proverbs themselves. So I want to start with Proverbs 1 through 9, chapters 1 through 9. Let me say first of all about chapters 1 through 9. Chapters 1 through 9 does not include the individual proverbial sayings that we've been talking about. Okay, they start in chapter 10 of the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs 1 through 9 includes rather longer passages called instructions. So after the prologue of the book of Proverbs, chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, the first instruction is chapter 1, 8 through 19. So 8 through 19, that's quite a few verses, and it's really dealing with peer pressure. So these are these instructions. They're longer passages. They're not these individual sayings, and they are parental instruction. Chapters 1 through 9 very clearly is parental instruction. My son is all throughout chapters 1 through 9. Now, it doesn't mean that daughters are not included, because at one point the father says to the son, listen to your mother's Torah, your mom's law. She lays down the law, right? So the women were also educated. Most of the education probably took place in the home, but this is parental instruction trying to teach young people to walk the way of wisdom. In fact, if you look at the beginning of the book of Proverbs, you get an idea of who the book of Proverbs is for. Now, it's for everybody. It's for the wise. But you see there, beginning in verse 3, chapter 1, verse 3, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple. The simple. It's also translated sometimes naive in some translations. It's parallel, if you notice there in verse 4, knowledge and discretion to the youth. So the word simple or naive in the book of Proverbs is talking about a period of life that we all go through. And in this period of life, the period of youth, many times we need to develop the ability to discern things and to make good decisions. An example of this would be an infant or a young toddler, young child. What do they do with everything that they pick up? Where does it go? Yes. Cracker, extension cord, okay? Doesn't matter. They haven't yet learned the ability to discern cracker good, right? And extension cord could be bad. So learning how to make good decisions is a part of what Proverbs 1 through 9 is all about. Parental instruction to develop discernment in the young person so that they will live a life of wisdom. So Proverbs 1 through 9 sets out the benefits of wisdom. And it sets out the negative consequences of living a life of foolishness. And part of what Proverbs 1 through 9 does is it tries to show the young person that they need to look beyond the immediate gratification of something that looks really good, something foolish that looks really good, to look beyond that to see what the real consequences are going to be in your life. And if you can get a young person to do that, they're on the road to being able to make good decisions based on the fear of the Lord, which we will come to at some point. So that's a part of the book of Proverbs as a whole, but especially 1 through 9, parental instruction. Also in chapters 1 through 9, the two ways are set forward. There's a way of wisdom also called the way of righteousness. There's a way of foolishness, also called the way of wickedness. And in Proverbs 1 through 9, these two ways are clearly set forth with the exhortation to the young person to choose the way of wisdom and to avoid the way of foolishness. Instructions. There's also something in chapters 1 through 9 called interludes. And they usually deal with the personification of wisdom. You've got Lady Wisdom. When you get to chapter 9 of Proverbs, you've got both Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly contrasted with each other, and it's coming to a head. You've got to make a decision. Which one of those are you going to follow? And of course, the foundation of it all is chapter 1, verse 7. So, chapters 1 through 9 acts as a foundation for the rest of the book, and acts as a foundation for the rest of the individual proverbial sayings. So there are no secular sayings in the book of Proverbs, because they all come out of that foundation that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay, that's chapters 1 through 9. Chapters 10 through 15. In chapters 10 through 15, they are composed almost exclusively of antithetical proverbs. Antithetical proverbs are proverbs that state a contrast. So there's usually a but in the middle of that to express the contrast. So if you look at chapter 10, this is where the individual proverbial sayings start, and chapters 10 through 15 are mostly antithetical proverbs. Not completely, but mostly antithetical proverbs. So an example would be chapter 10, verse 5. He who gathers in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who brings shame. So what these antithetical proverbs do is they reinforce the doctrine of the two ways that has just been presented in chapters 1 through 9. And they continue to reinforce the way of wisdom over against the way of foolishness. And so a prudent son, a wise son, is the one who gathers in the summer. But a son who sleeps during the harvest is a son who brings shame. It's wise not to sleep in the summer, but to gather in the summer when it's time to gather the harvest. So it's setting forth this distinction between wisdom and foolishness. So that's chapters 10 through 15, just reinforcing the doctrine of the two ways that you see laid out in chapters 1 through 9, continuing to show the difference between the way of wisdom and the way of foolishness as it's worked out in various situations. All right, then we come to chapters 16 through 22. And there are not very many antithetical proverbs in chapters 16 through 22. What we do have here are a couple of what are called better than sayings. Okay, I have an example in your handout. It says, better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. Think about that a minute. Better is a little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. Basically, what this is saying, it's better to have less, better to be poor with righteousness, righteousness being defined and living in the way that God would want you to live, than to be wealthy, than to be rich without justice, to be living in a way that's not pleasing to God. So it's better to be poor and to follow God than to be rich and hang with the wicked, basically. Better to be poor and follow God than to be rich and hang with the wicked. Now, what these kinds of proverbs teach us is that wealth is not an absolute good. It's not an absolute good. It's a relative good. Okay? So what that means is you cannot use wealth to judge someone's spiritual standing in life. Not all poor people are lazy. Okay? So this is helping us think through situations where there might be someone who's a part of God's people, who lives a life for God, but is not wealthy, you see. This gives us the other side. You can add to this the fact that that Proverbs recognize that there are extenuating circumstances in life. So, 13:23, Proverbs 13:23 talks about the fact that injustice takes away people's wealth. It actually says the fallow ground of the poor would yield much food, but it is swept away through injustice. So, you face situations in life of injustice, and it might affect your financial condition. There are also what we would call the mystery of God's sovereignty, acts of God. We may make all kinds of plans, and those plans may be really good plans. We may have our life set out for us, and we're living in a way that would please God, but things are going to come into our lives that we have no control over and that are going to affect our particular life situation. Things like tornadoes that might hit, your house might burn down, you might get sick. Okay, all these things are factors that have to be taken into consideration. So although the Proverbs realizes there's a connection between wealth and wisdom, it's not a guaranteed connection. Okay? So that's something important to understand. So basically what we've said here up to this point is that we don't want to make these individual proverbial sayings universal statements, because then that will run into trouble. Okay, let me jump down to the part of your handout where it says, how do Proverbs connect to Christ? All right? So let me say just a few things here, and this will also give us an added dimension to what we are talking about in relation to Proverbs. So Christ is the fulfillment of all the wisdom of the Proverbs. Colossians 2, verses 2 through 3. In him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom. We know that Christ established his kingdom at his first coming. And so what do we learn about his kingdom? Well, it's a spiritual kingdom, John 18 tells us. And so the emphasis in the New Testament is on spiritual blessing. It doesn't mean that the material blessing is not important, but there certainly is an emphasis on spiritual blessing. And we are told that as disciples of Jesus, we should expect to suffer persecution. Think about it. Persecution might affect your financial standing, as maybe is reflected in the book of Hebrews. And then we learn that the kingdom of Christ is here now. He established it. It's here, but it's not yet here in its fullness. The fullness of his kingdom will come when he comes back. We got the first coming of Christ. We got the second coming of Christ. And we will experience the fullness of his kingdom when Jesus comes again. Now, what this means for these individual proverbial sayings, and I think this is a helpful phrase to think about in terms of these proverbs are dependently true now, but will be ultimately true then. Dependently true now in this life, and many of them ultimately true when Jesus comes in the next life. They'll be ultimately true. So, what we mean by that, dependently true now, let's say a person tries to live their life according to the financial principles in the book of Proverbs. Generally speaking, that person's life will be better off than a person who does not live their life according to financial principles in Proverbs, lives a wild life, spending money here and there, running up credit cards. Okay, you can see the difference. And generally speaking, dependently true now, these Proverbs are dependently true now, that the person who lives according to the way laid out in the book of Proverbs will be better off financially. But it's not a guarantee. As we've said, there may be things that come into your life that would affect your financial situation. But when we finally come to the destination that God has for us in the new heavens and new earth, when Christ comes again, we'll have everything we need. Many of these proverbs will be true, ultimately true, completely true in the new heavens and the new earth. So, Does God want you to be healthy, wealthy, and wise? Well, concerning being wise, yes. Unqualified, yes. He wants you to be wise. He wants you to live according to the fear of the Lord, which leads to wisdom. The fear of the Lord is not being terrified of God. It's having a reverence for God. A reverence for God so that you're willing to submit your life to God, your whole life to God, and live in a way that He wants you to live. That's what the fear of the Lord is all about. Submitting yourself to the way of the Lord. A God-centered outlook on life. And it's really the most important thing in life. Our relationship with God is the most important thing in life. Now, concerning wealth, we may or may not be wealthy in this life, but we will be wealthy in the new heavens and new earth. We'll have everything we need. Everything we need. And in abundance. In fact, it's going to be greater than what we can even imagine in the new heavens and the new earth. Everyone in new heavens and new earth will have everything they need. Proverbs 19:4 will no longer apply because there won't be any poor people in the new heavens and new earth. So Proverbs 19:4 will no longer apply. Concerning health, we may or may not be healthy in this life. We all want to be healthy. Terrible being sick. We don't want anybody to go through seasons of sickness. But we do know that in the new heavens and new earth, we will be completely healthy, completely healed. A glorified physical body, no sorrow, no pain, nor death. We will be healthy in the new heavens and the new earth. And there will be no trouble for the righteous, as Proverbs 12:21 says. But the wicked, they'll be experiencing some trouble, won't they? They'll be separated from God in a place that's not very, very good to be in. So this, I think, helps us to understand these Proverbs as well. And ultimately, I think what we need to say here as we bring this to a close, God's goal for us, which should be our desire, is for us to grow in our relationship with Him. Sanctification is really what God desires for His people, so that God is more concerned about our holiness than He is about our health and wealth. And so wisdom is the key for our growth and sanctification, so we know that God wants us to live a life of wisdom. And so my final exhortation to you today is to live your lives with your eyes fixed on your final destination, which is new heavens, new earth, the coming of Jesus Christ. Don't get so involved. It's easy to do this, and we do need to be involved in this world and the things of this world because we're to be salt and light in this world, but don't get so overwhelmed by the things in this world that you forget that God has something tremendously prepared for you and for His people. So keep your eyes fixed on your true destiny, and that's where we will be fully healthy, wealthy, and we will be wiser there probably than we are here. So that's how I'd answer that question. Does God want us to be healthy, wealthy, and wise?